Okay, section 3, daily life in Rome. What was it like? Let's get to know these people a little bit. And that's our focus today, both out in the countryside and in the city itself. History seems to go on in the cities with everything that goes on with the politics and everything. But that's only less than 10% of the people. To really get to know a civilization, you really got to get to know the people. So we're going to do that just a little bit. What do you need to know? What was the average farmer's life like? What was the Romans' diet like? And is that the same at the top and the bottom of the social structure? How did urban Romans live? What was it like to live in the city of Rome? And finally, what did the Romans do for entertainment? That's a part of life. So we're going to deal with that today. Okay. 90% of Romans lived on small farms. Most of those were 3 to 7 acres in size. You can see a picture of it down here. You can see oxen that were tied off. 7 would be considered a large personal family farm. And so they would have to go ahead and farm that for, and usually grains, barley and wheat were the biggest of the crops. There would be also some vegetable farms. And the way the system worked, they'd use a half plant system. So if I had 3 acres, 1.5 acres would be plowed each year, and the other 1.5 acres would be left fallow. And they would let it recover so that it did not go ahead and lose all of its nutrients. It would recover a bit. Okay? So you only got 50% maximum productivity out of the land in terms of what was available. Their life was hard. Consider that as a farmer, you'd have to go ahead and start by plowing your fields up, and it would take a lot of time to get it ready. The ox was a community asset. Often, or several farmers would share that because they were extremely expensive. And you would be dragging a little more than a harness-pulled stick, sharp stick that would drag through the land. Today, we do this with machinery, and it's taken for granted. But this would take a long time. With a modern plow, the JI Case plow that you see that in the library, you'll see the old model, which was a lot more efficient than what these guys were using. You could plow maybe 1 acre a day, and boy, would it be hard work. With an ox-driven plow, these guys, it probably took longer. And sometimes they have to plow it up maybe 5 different times to prepare the soil for planting. That would take a couple weeks, perhaps. Then, when they were done, they prepared the soil by mixing in manure by hand. Okay, so if you haven't worked on a farm or don't know what the farming is like, today we take it for granted because fertilizers are sprayed. When I lived in Germany, a liquid-filled trailer with liquid manure would spray the stuff. They called it the honey wagon, and it would spray the fields. That's not what the Romans had to do. They would take baskets of manure and hand mix it into the soil to prepare it. Then they'd plant their crop, and this was not done very efficiently. Okay, they would go ahead hand sow it into the ground. Now, today, for every 50 bushels of grain, you need to save 1 to plant for the next year. Back then, it was for every 4 that you would raise, you'd have to save 1. So you wouldn't get a profit out of that, but you had to go ahead and take care of the next year's harvest, and you'd get that put into the ground. Then the family would have to weed the fields by hand throughout the growing season and occasionally water, depending upon the year. When that harvest would come, the farmers would realize a profit of maybe 5 to 10% by the time the taxes were levied, because tax collectors, people called publicans, who would contract out, would be there to raise taxes for a particular region. They'd get to keep any extra profit, so they would put the squeeze on the farmers. Small farmers in Rome were on the edge of starvation, is really what you need to know. The land was fertile, but farming was not efficient. And over the 2,000 years of the Roman Republican Empire, there was almost no innovation in agriculture. I want you to think about that when we get to the section about Roman technology. Now, the other thing that is important, remember we talked about socially, the Romans were farmers. When Rome called soldiers for war, the family had to run the farm in the farmer's absence. That is going to become extremely important. How about the Roman diet? Okay, grains made up 60 to 70% of the Roman diet. At one time, they thought it was maybe 80, 85%. They think that's not exactly right, because as they've done some archaeological digs, they found some other things in what was left over that would indicate maybe not so much. So a typical meal would be bread, not lightweight bread like what we have here that's all leavened. This would be pretty heavy bread, and something called pulse. It's a gruel, kind of like oatmeal, but with a lot of different spices mixed in. Garum, which is a fish sauce, was kind of like Roman ketchup. And there's a video that when you go through this, I'll let you play it. You can get it, by the way, today. And then something called moretum, which is a cheese spread where cheese and I believe also olive oil were mixed together. And there's lots of olive oil in the diet. Meat and fish would supplement. If you were near the coast, you'd get more fish than otherwise. But pork was also a favorite. The Romans loved pork. And so when they could, they would add that. And then fruits would supplement that because there were great vineyards and things like that. And then watered down wine were staples in the Roman diet. Wine was important because unlike water, where you could get really sick if you had spoiled water, wine with alcohol content kept bacteria out. So it was a normal part of the Roman diet. Okay, when you go ahead and follow this in yours, you can go ahead and click on this. You'll figure out how to go ahead and make garum. And if we get back into the school, if anybody's willing to do it, I will go buy a bottle of garum and get some bread, and anybody who wants to try it, to check it out. Okay, for patricians and wealthier Romans, there was a lot more variety in their diet. They would eat a whole bunch of different things. Multiple course meals would be served. And this was, again, part of that dignitas and odium combined, because you were taking care of your clients. You were also there to go ahead and show how important you were. So you wanted to put on a good show. These benches that you see in the picture below here were called a triclinium. It was designed for 3 people to recline on. The benches would be for 3 people each. You could put 3 of them around, so you could have 9 people around a small table. And if you had more people, then you'd have another table and another set of triclinium. And they would all recline, leaning on their left elbow, and they would eat. That's a picture of what it would look like. The low table, everybody kind of reclined on the triclinium, and the host would pick the subject of the day to talk about. Think of it as topic cards. So it might be a deep philosophical question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? It could be the events going on in the Senate. This was designed to impress clients and other fellow patrons with your hospitality. Roman table manners, dinner etiquette. Again, I'm going to let you play this. This comes out of Horrible Histories, but the excesses. This is not someplace you would be really comfortable in going to. So I'll let you guys take a look at that. Okay, patricians. In the city of Rome, there were 1,700 houses roughly for the patricians. Okay, these were pretty good sized estates. All right. Most Romans that were patricians, they'd had estates outside the city, and they didn't spend much time there. Most of their time was spent in houses here, so they had multiple houses, and these would have the live-in slaves would be a part of the household. It would be a little different than what you might otherwise expect. There's an atrium which would be open to which you kind of see in the center of this, which would have kind of a fountain and would be kind of an open area for them to come in. You'd see in the atrium, you'd have the house shrine to the gods that they preferred to worship, and each house would have that for their families. In contrast, the plebeians and the freedmen, the lower end of the scale, they lived in these huge apartment buildings called insulae. That translates to islands. And these could be 10 stories high. Patricians owned these buildings. The first floor was retail space for the merchants. So people might live above where they would work. And that's not too different than what we see in some cases in cities here. But in this case, I said there was 1,700 houses in Rome. There were 45,000, I believe, insulae, and they were owned by the patricians who would build them, usually poorly constructed, and it was not unknown for these buildings to collapse, killing a number of people. Protections were kind of minimal. They had zoning laws. We know that there were laws, which is kind of interesting when we start digging through it. But whether there was any consequence of that, maybe a whole different thing. 10 stories tall, there were people who would have to go 200 steps every day to get up to their apartment. The higher you were, the cheaper the rent, the lower your status, which once in America, by the way, it was kind of like that in the big cities. If you'll remember from your U.S. history, until the invention of the elevator. So there's some parallels that happen here. 47,000, I'm sorry. Okay. So it was a place that was built, and the representation, when we get to government, understand 47,000 to 1,700. And these were often big with many, many families in it. Okay, Romans had fast food places. Think McDonald's. You're looking at one here from Pompeii that they excavated. This counter had multiple pots, delicacies like garum. They'd have soup, so you could come by and go ahead and get something for the average citizen here. And underneath each of these pots that you see on the countertop, they'd have a small fire to keep it heated and hot. You could be a plebeian who would own or operate a place like this, and there was numbers of them all over the city. What do they do for work? Well, that depends upon who you're talking about. Patricians, they don't work. There was virtue in farming, but these guys weren't pushing plows. Not at all. Slaves did all that work. And they were on the big plantations. That's what they did. Owning land and working it for profit was the job of the patrician. Plebeians, on the other hand, could be small business people. Most worked day labor, and they were hired for a contract work, unskilled, depending upon the length of time for the contract. And depending upon that time of year, the workday varied because the amount of daylight hours varied from season to season. They'd work a 6-hour day, but a Roman hour wasn't standard. During the winter, that hour lasted about 45 minutes because sunrise came later and sunset came early. During the summer, that hour would be 75 minutes long. So it could be a very long day during the summer in the heat. Bread and circuses. Okay, that's a term that gets used to talk about how the plebeians were entertained and how the leaders got the support. Patricians authorized the distribution of free bread at reduced bread prices for poor plebeians of Rome. They would come out a couple times a week and they would have the bread giveaway. Well, at first this was paid for by the patricians, but over time, this became part of the tax burden on all the provinces. For entertainment, Romans enjoyed theater. They loved to gamble. We know that because we looked at their headstones And we also know that that was often referenced in some of their correspondence. And contests in the Colosseum and at the Circus Maximus. Those were the two venues. The Colosseum was a stadium, and you've seen it in all the movies. 50,000 people could sit at the Colosseum, and it was an amazing place. They had ropes that went across, and they had essentially sails, and they had the Roman Navy would be there to go ahead and pull those shades to keep the sun out, or also other weather. So it was like a dome stadium almost. At times they would flood the stadium and have sea battles, mock sea battles. They'd have gladiator fights. They'd go ahead and execute their criminals. Would go in and they would do that in the Colosseum. They would have, when the emperors would change later, up to 100 days of competitions. Thousands and thousands of animals were slaughtered or fought to the death in the stadium. The patricians were the primary people that would use the Colosseum. However, it was open for soldiers and for the plebeians as well. The Colosseum seating was divided by class. Women could only sit in the upper section of the stadium, along with the slaves. Citizens and soldiers, plebeians, they were down next. Then important officials, and finally the senators. Those were the elites of society. Circus Maximus, and by the way, the remains are still there, and it gets used in Rome, was a huge stadium. It seated about probably 150,000. Roman historians said they could seat 250,000, but probably that was an exaggeration. This was the favorite of the plebeians, and they would have chariot racing. Okay, if you've seen the movie Ben-Hur, you know what chariot racing was. This was big sport, and again, they would gamble on it. There were teams, and this was big money. This was like NASCAR. You'd have the reds, the greens, the whites, and the blues. There were 2 chariot races. There were 2-horse chariot races and 4-horse chariot races. Occasionally, violence would break out in the stands, between the fans of the teams. So it was a big event, and it was sponsored. And boy, if you were a charioteer and were successful, you were a rock star. Just like being a gladiator would be like an NFL player today. It would be the same for the charioteers. People would bet on it. They would come. That would be great entertainment for them. This is time for you to think. Did the patricians support the games and the bread distribution just to gain dignitas and influence and power among the ruling class? Or do you think this was a way to pacify the lower classes to keep order and keep them in power? Is the best question about bread and circuses a what or a why question? What do you think? Okay, here's your warning. The content you might watch when you watch this one could be disgusting. If you want to go to Rome and do as the Romans do, you be my guest. But I wanted to give you this one. If you want to bypass it, that's outstanding. Go right ahead and do that as well. Okay, in summary, Roman farmers barely got by. This is going to cause a problem when Rome increasingly is at war. Romans' diet included a lot of grains, wine, olive oil. Wealthy patricians ate much better than the plebeians. There was a lot of excesses, as you saw in that video, tied to dignitas and odium. The freedmen were frequently wealthier than the average Roman plebeian, as many were skilled craftsmen. Plebeians lived in apartments, and they worked a lot of day labor jobs, hauling things for construction projects. The patronage system tied the classes together. Clients supported their patrons. Patrons took care of their clients. And then bread and circuses were provided by the patricians. For what reason? You have to decide.